Speech starts in 3, 2, 1. Good evening, honorable judges. Today I will be opposing today's motion about that this House would adopt student loan mechanisms within Indonesia. First is the definitions. Student loan is the borrowment of funds towards students for them to be able to pay tuition fees. Mechanisms in this context is how such a policy could be implemented and realized. Now, currently, many students around Indonesia doesn't get the opportunity to advance towards a higher level of education. The root causes of this problem are the lack of domestic financial support from their families and the lack of academic preparedness. To adopt student loan policy in Indonesia would only worsen the academic opportunity and the current economic state of Indonesia. Now, the vulnerable actors today's motion is that every student pursuing a higher level of education within Indonesia. This includes students who are able to pay tuition fees, students within scholarship programs, and tuition within the student loan program mechanisms itself. Secondly is the Indonesian economy. Thirdly, university tuition fees. Fourthly is the job market in Indonesia. Now, the burden of proof on the government team, they have to propose a mechanism to implement and realize such a policy. Now, the opposition team just has to rebut and question the legitimacy of the policy. Now, our first argument is the increasing unemployment rates within Indonesia. The underlying problem and cause of unemployment rates in Indonesia is due to the fact that there aren't many jobs available for workers and students around Indonesia. By implementing student loans, yes, it does increase the amount of students advancing towards a higher education and graduating from those institutions. However, this will only sabotage the already drowning unemployment rates within Indonesia. Let me explain. First, student loan program gets passed. Secondly, more graduates and more students will be able to graduate. Thirdly, these students would look out and seek jobs to pay off their student debt. Fourthly, due to the lack of job available to these students, the unemployment rate will rise and it will create the job market to be more competitive and strict. Therefore, with all of the factors in place, the economy will only be driven down. This implementation of the policy would only worsen the current economic state in Indonesia and potentially crash it. Secondly, the tuition inflation within universities. Now, with the newly subsidized student loan policy, this would drive the demand of people who are able to apply to universities. Yes. However, the first law of the economic equilibrium states that with higher demand is to rise the price. Now, with more students applying to universities will increase the demand, universities will be incentivized to raise the price of tuition fees to reach the state of equilibrium. This sabotages students who are already eligible for tuition fees in the first place, and it would only further ruin the crisis of the lack of financial support for these students to apply towards a higher level of education. Thirdly is the mental burden that comes from student loan. Now, Indonesia already has a strict and competitive job market, which has resulted in the majority of teenagers, students, and workers applying to this job having their mental well-being crashed, abolished. With the additional students flowing from the student loan programs, this will lead to the job market to be far more competitive. Therefore, most students will be burdened and be mentally taxed by this new phenomenon. For example, a student from ITB has spent years and a large amount of sums of financial backing from the government within the student loan program. He is a top student. He has spent years studying within their institution. However, with the competitiveness in the job market, this student will be left unemployed and carrying a massive debt to his name, worsening their mental state. This could lead to self-harm or even acts of suicide. Fourthly is the lack of resources Indonesia has. A student loan program requires strict legal framework and income tracking capabilities and a bureaucratic execution that Indonesia does not have the basis and foundation to begin with. With the rampant corruption within our government, the low tax compliance rate within the region, such a program cannot be maintained and sustained. And there is no proof or guarantee that our government will acquire the money that student loans will pay back. Now, comes to our rebuttals from the government team is the difference between Singapore and Indonesia. The government proposes to implement Singapore's model of student loan programs. However, this approach is unrealistic and could not be implemented in Indonesia standards for the following reasons. Firstly is the academic reputation and credibility Singapore has compared to Indonesia. Singapore houses one of the world's most prestigious institutions with student loan programs. These students are trusted and to be able to repay back the loan due to the Singaporean academic background and credibility from their respective universities and academic institutions. This will be more feasible to get a job rather than getting a job in Indonesia. For example, as an interviewer, would you rather accept a student from a prestigious National University of Singapore or someone from University of Indonesia? Of course, you would choose NUS. They have the proper basis of foundation to build upon and conduct a student loan system to begin with. Now, second is the size of our nation. Now, territorial-wise, Indonesia is quite a large archipelago. It spans over millions of miles. Compared to Singapore compared to Indonesia is just a tiny speck within our large territorial archipelago. This, however, with this small size, this makes the administrative enforcement to enforce such a policy to be much more feasible and cheaper and makes more sense. For example, we do not have enough manpower and administrative force to cover the entirety of Indonesia to begin with. Singapore has already built upon the basis and foundation to enact such student loans to begin with. Now, second is thirdly the contingent income plan proposed by the government team, reflecting upon Singapore's student loan model. Now, it's simple. Student enrolls in the student loan program, they graduate, they get employed, and only after they are employed would they start paying their loans. However, what defines employment? Now, within the current status quo of Indonesia, we hold one of the most massive informal sector of employment in the first place. In the first place, we do not possess the necessary resources and capabilities to audit such income tracking and define what being employed is in the first place. Now, the goal of today's motion is to prove that the mechanisms provided by the government team is unrealistic to Indonesian standards. Indonesia lacks the foundation and basis to conduct such a policy in the first place. And for all of those reasons above, this House is proud to oppose. Thank you very much.